From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking about the ongoing dispute between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. We'll also be looking at the broader regional picture, touching on recent developments in Somaliland, and changing dynamics in the Horn of Africa. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got two great guests joining the program today, Mirette Mabrouk and Guled Ahmed. Mirette is a senior fellow and the head of MEI's Egypt program. Guled is a non-resident scholar with MEI, a renewable energy and water infrastructure expert, and an entrepreneur. Mirette, Guled, thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having us.
Mirette, the GERD project has been contentious since it was first announced back in 2011, and the dispute over the dam has been going on in one form or another for years now. Following the failure of U.S.-sponsored talks in late 2019 and early 2020, the African Union recently held its own round of negotiations. What, if anything, came out of those talks?
To date, I think it's fair to say probably nothing has come out of the AU talks. The situation is very much what it has been over the last 10 years. Now, the only thing that did come out of it, which I thought was hopeful, was a fairly obvious attempt to try and ratchet down tensions, which had been rising, but it basically arrived in the form of really, really flowery statements from everybody. I mean, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Ahmed, said that the talks were fruitful. He thanked his brothers Hamdok and Sisi, Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok of Sudan, and President Abdel Fattah Sisi of Egypt. He thanked them. He said that we were going to continue to go on with the talks, but it was important that he said that we are going to continue to discuss technical aspects of the talks. The Egyptian and Sudanese statements referred to, we'd like to continue with the talks and come up with a binding agreement. Now, the thing is, in the middle of all that, of course, there were questions about whether Ethiopia had started filling the dam, because Sudan and Egypt had asked that Ethiopia not start unilaterally filling without an agreement. And then the Ethiopian Minister of Irrigation, Selesha Bekele, had to walk back comments that had been made on state broadcasting that the dam had started filling. And he said, well, it's just due to the rains and everyone knows this. And then, a few days later, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, said the conditions were conducive to filling the dam. So, the dam has started. The only issue is the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who is South Africa, of course, is currently the head of the African Union, had said that Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan had agreed on the process of finalizing negotiations on the text of a binding agreement on the filling and the operation of GERD, which included a comprehensive agreement on future development of the Blue Nile River, which, of course, would be what Sudan and Egypt want. The problem is the Ethiopian spokesperson, Dina Mufti, announced right after to an Emirati newspaper, I think, that the Ethiopian government does not look for a binding agreement, only a guidelines agreement which can be revised at any time. And this has been the major point of contention throughout all the negotiations, that there is no binding agreement, that there is no dispute mechanism, and that the downstream countries have no recourse in cases of disagreement on the filling or on the operation of the dam.
Brett, taking a step back, what is each of the three countries involved in these talks looking to achieve, and what are they trying to avoid?
Okay, so for Ethiopia is looking to this dam to help it develop, to help it grow. The dam was built with Ethiopian money. Its people are looking to this dam to help power their growth engine. It's a hydropower dam, so it's for electricity. Ethiopia is looking to become a regional powerhouse and is looking to export electricity. That's very important to them. Egypt and Sudan don't have any problems with that. Of course, even if they did have problems, that's not the issue. But there are actually, no one at any point is saying, gosh, the dam can't go forward. And I don't mean now when the dam is complete. I mean as far back as 10 years ago. What Egypt and Sudan are looking to avoid is problems arising from a lack of water in the case of a drought, because under normal circumstances, there shouldn't really be a problem for the downstream countries. Although we don't know, because the GERD is the only dam of its kind ever to have been built without an environmental and sustainable impact assessment. So no one really knows what the effect on the downstream countries will be. But what is certain is that under normal circumstances, dams can provide many advantages, and especially this one is likely to especially provide one in the case of Sudan, because Sudan is always hit quite hard by the flooding, and one of the advantages of dam is that it helps regulate water and helps to release it when it's not there. So there are advantages. The big disadvantage comes in terms of when you have a drought or when you have water shortages. Because this is a hydropower dam, the dam needs the water to be able to generate hydropower. So the question is, if that water is not released, then the downstream countries aren't going to have the water. And Sudan is 50% desert. Egypt is 96% desert. Egypt relies on the Nile for over 90% of all its fresh water. So in cases of drought or water shortages, the potential for these two countries could be dreadful.
Guled, Ethiopia is experiencing significant domestic unrest at present. How does that factor into the GERD dispute, and why has the broader Horn of Africa region become more fragile since Abiy Ahmed became prime minister 2 years ago?
Thanks, Alistair. The first part, if I may address how the current dispute instability going on in Ethiopia will harm in the GERD. Abiy, when he became prime minister, he made so many reforms such as bringing peace to the region and stability and also development. He hasn't achieved all those promises. And this instability now, it comes because of there was ethnic conflict going on while he was coming to power. And rather focusing that internal conflict within Ethiopia, he has focused on external neighbors, for example, Eritrea and Somalia. The first thing he promised was that he will make Horn Africa as one country, for example, Somalia and Ethiopia as one country, a greater Horn of Africa. And this idea is agreed with the European alliance that interested in Horn Africa economic integration. And the country also currently is suffering economic downturn. And all those factored in brought a lot of instability in the region. And the GERD now became the cry to attract more alliance within Ethiopia, ethnics, that by filling the dam, that will be a political win for him. So this is why it's kind of dangerous during the negotiation. Abiy is coming from that angle that he has to satisfy the Ethiopian nationalists that some kind of bribe to fill the dam will attract more parties to join him. And this will, in terms of going forward with the negotiation with Egypt, that will not have result any fruitful. This will lead to more dispute, and it will continue in the long term. That's the first part. The second part, where since he became to power, there was ethnic conflict ongoing already, especially the Oromo regions and in Amhara and Tigray regions, and all those has not been addressed. And the political reforms he proposed was not implemented in a way that makes satisfactory between among the ethnics living in Ethiopia. So this will bring more fragility in terms of in the long term, and especially with his grandiose idea to make Horn Africa as one country. Somalia, he visited in Somalia, Mogadishu in 2018, I believe, or 2019 early. And he made a deal with the current Somali president, Mohammed Abdullahi Farmajo, that he will get access to 4 ports. And this was kind of a memorandum of understanding. It's not a legally binding, but that brings more attention to still, as you know, Somalia still have some stability issues and security issues. And this is what makes Ethiopia current instability obvious, because of the concentration he gave more on outside the internal.
So far, we've been largely focused on the kind of disputes and potential problems stemming from the GERD. But what about the potential benefits as well? Would it help to address issues like Ethiopia's lack of access to energy and food shortages?
So the last part of the question, if GERD will address the energy access and the food shortage. Currently, Ethiopia has installed 17 gigawatts. And if you look per capita energy, it's about 1,300 kilowatt hours per capita per person per year. That is more than that is sufficient for their citizens to get. However, Ethiopia, since starting building all these dams on several other rivers, their goal was to sell the electricity to neighboring countries. So the problem is, this is why they have 50% of the population don't have access to electricity. So GERD, of course, has a potential benefits. Of course, it's going to have a potential irrigation of up to 500,000 hectares. And also, as they claim, Ethiopia, that it will generate 6 gigawatt. In fact, studies show that it is less than that. It's half of that, 3 gigawatt. So this is another issue that has to be looked at during the GERD. 6 gigawatt is not what's expected, but maybe it's 3 gigawatt. However, addressing the energy and food shortage, definitely it will benefit, but that it depends on if Ethiopia goal is to address the electricity. Right now, I'll give you another example. Ethiopia energy crisis. They can use the current, their renewable energy, which they generate from hydropower, for industrial. But for example, their cement factories don't have adequate electricity to power their industries. So they import more than 500,000 metric tons of coal to Ethiopia to power their cement factories. So instead of selling and importing electricity to neighboring, they could use internally for those generating electricity. That is what I think is missing. And I think the food shortages also needs electricity for irrigation purposes and all that. Those have not been used properly in Ethiopia. And that is the challenge. GERD has benefits, but it all depends on how Ethiopia approach and use it.
So you're saying basically that there are better ways of achieving the same goals, for example, renewable energy, in terms of addressing the issues of energy poverty, of food security, and climate change. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's other alternative that is still there that can be used to generate electricity by, for example, they have projects such as solar, wind projects. Currently, they have an agreement with Kenya to develop geothermal, which is Power Africa also is funding partially of that project, which is very successful. So there are alternative ways to develop energy, I think, if Ethiopia follows that path.
Mirette, the GERD dispute seems to be the subject of a lot of confusion here in Washington. People realize it's important, but they don't really understand it. And at best, they only seem to pay kind of sporadic attention to it. What, in your view, are kind of the biggest misconceptions around this?
So I think the misconceptions actually extend beyond Washington. I think misconceptions in DC. I think there are misconceptions in Europe. I think there are misconceptions in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. Let's start with Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. So I think one of the biggest problems has been the idea that Ethiopia has said that Egypt and Sudan are trying to corral Ethiopia into colonial era agreements. And there's often mention of the 1959 agreement, which apportioned most of the Nile River basin water to Egypt and Sudan, 55 billion cubic meters to Egypt and 18 to Sudan. That's of the Nile River basin, not the Nile waters. But the thing is, when Egyptians refer to any agreements with Ethiopia, the only agreements that are actually being referred to are the 1902 agreement signed with Emperor Menelik II, the 1993 agreement signed by Prime Minister Meles Zenawi and President Hosni Mubarak, and the 2015 Declaration of Independence signed by Ahmed Sisi and then former President Bashir of Sudan. So there aren't any colonial era agreements. It's just those agreements. There's the idea that Egypt has hogged all the Nile water. Egypt is the most downstream of all the Nile countries. I mean, there are 11 countries that share the Nile water. Egypt is the most downstream one. It isn't capable of taking anyone's water. That's why it's likely to be more hurt than anyone else if there are disruptions in the Nile. In Egypt and Sudan, I think there is the idea that Ethiopia wants to benefit at their expense, or Ethiopia is out to get them. I read a lot of Ethiopian analysis in newspapers and social media. I do not get the impression that Ethiopians are out to get Egypt or Sudan. The Ethiopians want to develop their country, and the idea that they have in their mind is that 86% of the Blue Nile's waters originate in Egypt. They have not used this water, and it is their time to grow. All of which is perfectly reasonable. As far as international concerns, I think there is the idea that this is merely a quarrel between three countries, and it really isn't relevant. So the problem is it actually is relevant because conflict in this area would be disastrous. Most international countries are heavily invested in one way or other in all three of these countries. For Egypt and Sudan, as I've said earlier, Egypt has no other sources of water. And again, contrary to popular belief, it's never found the legendary vast untapped groundwater resources. That theory has been floating around for a decade. No one's ever found any water, and if you were to find it, we don't know what levels it would be at, and you don't know what salinity it would be at, and you don't know whether it would be any good for anything if you ever found it. Plus, there is the fact that you really can't compare non-renewable water resources to renewable water resources. I mean, Egyptians sort of take a look and say, we're talking about 55 billion cubic meters here. Well, Ethiopia gets 936 billion cubic meters just in rainfall every year. That's renewable that goes into its rivers and streams. There's a fair amount of mistrust everywhere. But again, internationally, there's the idea that it's the squabble between three countries, and it's not going to be that bad. It is very likely to be that bad if there is no agreement and you enter into a period of drought. This is the biggest problem. And of course, another one of the worries is that Egypt and Sudan has is that they've already taken a good look at what's happened to Djibouti, Kenya, and Somalia, which have both suffered enormously from similar Ethiopian water projects. So they don't want to be in that position. And for other international players, Ethiopia is an important country. Egypt is an important country. Sudan is, but also Sudan at the moment is very, very fragile. It's in the middle of a transition and really doesn't need any more upheaval. But everyone has investments. Egypt has the Suez Canal. Ethiopia is vital in Africa. It is not in anyone's interests to allow tension to develop into a conflict.
In light of everything that's at stake, how much international involvement has there been on this issue, and what role, if any, is China playing here?
Okay, so I think we need to distinguish between international involvement and international interest. There isn't that much international involvement, and no one wants to get in the middle of this. Okay, because most countries have interests, as I said, in all three countries, and no one wants to get in the middle of this. Specifically, you mentioned China. I think at the UNSC meeting, China, I think, was the only country that said that water issues should not be brought to the UNSC. I think, partly that's because China has its own transboundary water issues, but also China has an investment at stake. Now, the dam itself was built with Ethiopian money, entirely built with Ethiopian money. However, back in 2013, the Chinese sunk 1.2 billion, gave the Ethiopian government a loan of 1.2 billion for power transmission lines for that dam. And then last year, they promised another 1.8 billion for an energy grid for the dam. And Chinese subcontractors have about 150 million worth of contracts for this dam. So China has a definite involvement here, because the whole point of a hydropower dam is to produce electricity, and if they can't sell it, then it's about as much use as a speedboat in the Kalahari, I'm guessing. So there are definite interests. On the other hand, China also has interest in investment in Egypt. Egypt is essential for the Belt and Road initiative that China has. So I think the idea is everyone wants to stay as clear of this as possible. But again, I'm not sure that ultimately that's going to be in anyone's interest.
Mirette just touched on the role of China in the GERD talks, but that's by no means the only issue of interest for China in the region right now. Beijing has also been party to a dispute over Somaliland's recent bilateral agreement with Taiwan, for instance. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about that, what prompted it, and how China and Somalia have responded so far.
Yeah, the recent agreement between Taiwan and Somaliland, it started back in 2009. It wasn't official, but there was relation ongoing back then. But recently, the current president of Somaliland, Musa Bihi, is aggressively looking for international recognition for his independent country that's not recognized, just like Taiwan, Somaliland. That to make sure that they get international recognition, they've approached Taiwan to set up a representative exchange representative, not diplomatically, but just a representative between the two countries. An exchange such as technological transfer. Taiwan promised that they will provide, invest in fishing, agriculture, and maritime, and also industrial. As you know, Taiwan is one of the Asia four tigers, as known, that has developed their economy independently and has been successful. And they are highly technologically advanced in the world. They are in the fifth place in the world in terms of the technological advance. China benefit from their technological advance. So for Taiwan to be in Horn Africa, it's a threat for China engagement in Horn Africa. This is why right away the China ambassador was sent to the Somali president to issue condemnation and rejection of the agreement. This shows that China, using their development in Horn Africa, typically they use what some people call debt trap, but I call development trap, to engage Horn African countries to influence, to fight back or reject the Taiwan agreement with other countries. In Somalia, it's very interesting because in Somalia, it's an aid-dependent country, and the only country that provides the majority of the funding to Somalia is USA. It's very interesting that White House National Security Council blessed this agreement. This is what was a blow to China. And though America provides the majority of the aid to Somalia, has not pushed harder to engage more from that aspect in China, aggressive in Horn Africa. So this brings that the importance of this relation between Somaliland and Taiwan.
But as you said, while Somaliland is looking to strengthen its foreign relations, its options are pretty limited. Do you think it's likely to expand its ties with Taiwan further going forward, especially given that the Taipei Act essentially encourages and rewards that?
Yes, I believe that. I'm glad you mentioned Taipei Act. That's the key point. Taiwan currently have a relation with 15 countries around the world. And Taipei Act, which passed by the Congress and the Senate last year, which Trump administration signed, is basically encouraging Taiwan and other countries to set up relation with Taiwan and reward those countries that set up relation with Taiwan and banish the ones that cut off the relation. Typically, China, what it does is that it will go to those countries that have relation with Taiwan and either pressure them with or use development trap and to get off Taiwan relation. And Taipei Act, what it will do is that it will banish those countries that basically get away from that agreement that they had with Taiwan. Now, this it brings an opportunity for Somaliland, as I heard some of their political insiders in the region in Somaliland. They are currently evaluating to recognize Taiwan, and Taiwan is also definitely will recognize Somaliland in near future. And what that will do is it will benefit the whole Africa definitely, because now Taiwan can develop in Somaliland in terms of technology and also the maritime, which they have. Somaliland have their own maritime. This will help Somaliland to get recognition with the Taiwan in near future.
You're right. Egypt's also been developing closer ties with Somaliland of late. What are Cairo's objectives there, and how does that fit into Egypt's broader efforts to expand its involvement in East Africa?
About a week ago, there was a high-level delegation, Egyptian delegation, that went to visit Somaliland. And actually, this trip had apparently been in the works since early March. And apparently, they went and they had discussions on investment, on foreign affairs, on fisheries, on livestock, all the sorts of things that you would expect people to be discussing in a country that they want to do more business with. And the thing is, Egypt had for a long time, if not neglected Africa, then certainly not looked to it as much as it should have, considering that it's part of Africa. But that has been changing, I think, for the past 7 to 8 years. Egypt has made a concerted effort to try and improve political and economic ties with Africa, and it's in Egypt's interest. It's a vast market. Egypt is part of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was signed July of last year. It has the potential to pull together 1.3 billion consumers, if you like, for a $3 trillion market. So it's huge. And I think it is about time. So I think the visit to Somaliland, I think, was viewed, especially by the Ethiopians, as an attempt to try and get in there fast and connect it to GERD. I doubt that GERD is in no way unconnected, of course, but it is part of a larger Egyptian trend, recent Egyptian trend, to try and push back into Africa, to try and set up trade and technical ties, and to try and, I think, take up its place as more of an African country than perhaps it had seen itself before.
Guled, we're running short on time, but before we wrap up, how could Egypt's new relationship with Somaliland and its outreach to Africa that Mirette was just talking about impact the broader geopolitical dynamics in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region?
The Egypt recent visit to Somaliland is a new development, which a lot of the neighbor countries like Ethiopia has seen as a threat. But a lot of people are missing the relation between historical relation between Somaliland and Egypt. I've published a recent article at the Middle East Institute that called Somaliland Port, the Horn Africa most valuable real estate. The reason I published that is because in 1500th century, Ottoman Empire was there in Berbera to protect the Portuguese coming to the Red Sea area. And after on 18th century, they have transferred that responsibility to Egypt, Sultan who was there at that time. So that history is still there. So Egypt, what it can bring Somaliland is in terms of renewable energy and energy development. Egypt is well known for Africa in terms of developing renewable energy in solar, winds in their country to supplement what they have right now. And so from that aspect for development, it is important. At the same, and I want to agree with Mirette, the Egypt has neglected Africa in the past to engage, but right now is aggressively looking into engaging more, which is really good sign. And what it will bring now, it will bring stability, especially in the Horn Africa. And in collaboration with the Somaliland government in terms of developing in fishery and agriculture and also in maritime, I think this will help in the long run stability of the region. and the international community. So, I've talked about in my article in last part, is that the fragility of that, because Somaliland is looking to get recognition, a lot of region players will be competing for Somaliland to get their attention, and this has to be looked really careful how to be approached. I think Egypt, because of its historical relation with the Somaliland, I think will be a plus. And I think this, since Egypt is included in the Red Sea Council, I think they can bring Somaliland as a partner to engage to protect their maritime, because Somalia right now doesn't have a well-built maritime navy. I think this is where Somaliland could help in Red Sea region. That's an opportunity that could be tapped into.
Mirette, you've got the last word. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
I think perhaps just to say that all of this interest in the Horn is perhaps belated, but right on the nose. But I do think that it is an important time for the region, and an interesting time, and an opportunity perhaps for the region to take control of its own development rather than continuously sort of be seen as an investment location for people. I think it's important for the countries of the region to be seen as investment partners, and to allow the countries of the region the ability to set their own terms, to direct their own futures, to see to their own interests, rather than simply be seen as a repository for other nations' interests, I think.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Mirette, Guled, thank you both for joining the podcast.
And thank you for having us.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.